Imagine this. It's the 7th century, and a superpower just vanishes. An empire that had dominated the Near East for over 400 years, a legit rival to Rome itself, was basically erased from the map in less than a decade. I mean, this wasn't some slow, lingering decline, it was a total, catastrophic collapse. So today, we're going to be like forensic historians, and we're examining the body of the Sasanian Empire to figure out the cause of death.
So what really happened here? On one hand, you've got these lightning-fast Arab conquests that just seem to swallow this huge, secure empire whole. So was this mighty fortress just breached by some unstoppable outside force? Or was it more like a house that was already crumbling from the inside and just needed one last push to fall over? That's the mystery we are unpacking today. All right, so our first stop on this investigation takes us deep inside Sasanian society itself. You know, an empire's strength isn't just in its armies, it's in its people. And let me tell you, the Sasanian social structure was anything but unified. Okay, so Sasanian society was built on the super rigid foundation of 4 classes, or peshag. Right at the top, you've got the priests and the warriors, the big shots. Below them, you had the bureaucrats, the scribes. And then at the very bottom, you had pretty much everyone else, the farmers, the artisans, the common folk. Now this system, which was totally backed by the state religion, Zoroastrianism, was all about creating order, but it also created a huge problem. You had basically zero chance of moving up in the world. If you were born a farmer, guess what? You died a farmer. And that created these deep, simmering tensions just waiting to boil over.
And well, in the late 5th century, all that tension just exploded into what you could call a social earthquake. A priest named Mazdak started preaching this really radical, almost communistic message. He was calling for the equal distribution of wealth, of land, even of women. Now, for the masses who had nothing, this sounded like a revolutionary promise of justice. But for the nobility and the priesthood, oh man, this was a terrifying threat to their entire world order.
Now, what happened next is just fascinating. The king, Kavad I, he actually supported the Mazdakites at first, using all that chaos to kind of break the power of the really big, overbearing nobles. But ultimately, the whole movement was brutally crushed by his son, the famous Khosrow I. So the rebellion failed to break the caste system, but it left this bitter legacy. And Khosrow's reforms, which were meant to stabilize things, actually created a whole new class of smaller landowners, the Dahans. Remember that name? These local lords are going to play a super important role later in our story.
Okay, clue number 2 in our investigation. This is an external factor that basically bled the empire dry. For centuries, the Sasanians and the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire were locked in this epic superpower struggle. But their final conflict? It was on a whole other level.
This wasn't just another border skirmish. Historians call it the last great war of antiquity. And for a hot minute, it really looked like the Sasanian king, Khosrow II, had won it all. His armies conquered the Levant, they took Egypt, and they were literally standing at the gates of Constantinople. But then came one of the most stunning reversals in all of history. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched this brilliant, desperate counterattack, striking deep into the Sasanian heartland. After nearly 30 years of non-stop fighting, the war ended not with a clear winner, but with 2 completely exhausted empires, basically on their knees.
And see, this is what makes the whole thing so mind-boggling. The Sasanian military was a fearsome machine. Its backbone was the Asamaran, this elite class of heavily armored knights. Their tactics on the battlefield were so effective, they would go on to inspire both the later Islamic cavalry and even the feudal knights of Western Europe.
Just listen to how the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus described them. I mean, these guys weren't just soldiers, they were riding fortresses. They were the apex predators of the ancient battlefield. So how in the world could an army like this just fall apart?
Well, the answer is actually pretty simple: exhaustion. That final war against Byzantium had stretched the army way too thin and, more importantly, it completely emptied the treasury. The government had to impose these crushing taxes on the people just to pay for decades of war. The Sasanian war machine was powerful, for sure, but it had finally completely run out of fuel.
Let's move on to our third clue, which really gets to the ideological heart of the empire. What happens when the twin pillars of your state, the king and the state religion, start to crack?
So the relationship between the Sasanian kings and the Zoroastrian priesthood was symbiotic. It was a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal. The king needed the priests to say his rule was divinely ordained, to give him legitimacy. And in return, the state enforced Zoroastrianism, which propped up the social order the priests loved. But this created a constant power struggle. The priesthood, the magi, became incredibly powerful, and they often pushed the kings to persecute rival faiths like Christianity and Manichaeism, which were gaining followers and threatening that religious unity.
The entire identity of the monarch, the Shahanshah or King of Kings, was fused with this religious role. Just look at their coins. It's amazing. On one side, you have the king's portrait. On the other, you have the sacred fire of Zoroaster. It's the perfect symbol of how political and divine authority were inseparable. To challenge the religion was to challenge the king himself, and to challenge the king was, well, heresy.
But here's where things get really interesting for historians. That whole image of an all-powerful king controlling everything from the center, it's now being seriously challenged. And this brings us to a really fascinating academic debate about how Sasanian power actually worked. For a long time, the common view was that the Sasanian state was a highly centralized monarchy, with the king having absolute control. But a newer idea, proposed by historians like Parvaneh Pourshariati, argues it was more of a Sasanian-Parthian confederacy. This theory suggests the King of Kings wasn't really an absolute ruler at all. Instead, he was more like the head of a confederation, ruling with the consent and, crucially, the military support of these ancient, super-powerful Parthian noble families. And this reliance on these powerful lords was a critical structural weakness built right into the system.
So now we've got all our clues laid out on the table. We have social tension, we have military and economic exhaustion, and a political state that was way more fragmented than it looked. Let's bring it all together and understand the final, fatal moments of the Sasanian Empire.
This is the moment of the final blow. When the early Arab armies came charging out of the desert, they weren't attacking a superpower at the height of its power. No way. They were attacking a hollowed-out giant, an empire that was already bleeding from a dozen internal wounds and reeling from a perfect storm of crises.
So what's our final verdict here? The Sasanian Empire didn't die from a single knockout punch. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The war with Byzantium was devastating, yes, but the empire's fate was truly sealed by its own internal divisions. Critically, during that final war, powerful Parthian generals actually mutinied, which shattered the army's unity. Then, after Khosrow II's death, the empire was paralyzed by a power vacuum, with kings coming and going. And those local lords, the decans, the very class that was supposed to stabilize the empire, they often saw more benefit in just making a deal with the new invaders than in dying for a broken central government.
But here is the final amazing twist. While the Sasanian state totally collapsed, Sasanian civilization didn't just disappear. Not at all. It's a perfect example of how a culture can outlive a political entity. The sophisticated Sasanian bureaucracy, it became the administrative blueprint for the later Abbasid Caliphate. Their military tactics were adopted by their conquerors. Their art, their architecture, their fancy courtly manners, they became the very definition of high culture in the early Islamic world. It's like the empire died, but its ghost lived on.
So, what do you think? Does a civilization ever really die, or does it just kind of transform, its pieces becoming the building blocks for whatever comes next? Let us know what you think down in the comments. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, the best way you can support what we do is to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this explainer with someone else who loves to unpack the past. We'll see you on the next one.